Kia ora, Simon. Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Wajirani Adhihetty, soko ingoa. Mage nama Wajirani Adhihetty, mama ආවේ ලංකාවේ ඉඳලා නවසීලන්තේ පදිංචියට මගේ පවුලත් එක්ක. I came from Sri Lanka 3 years ago with my family, and we live in Wellington and enjoying the life we are having in New Zealand. Thank you. It's wonderful and honored to be joining today with this public program of Whenua Ūkaipō to celebrate United Nations 75th anniversary, giving special focus to 2030 Agenda and SDGs. I have huge work to do to give an introduction to this event, and I would like to take this opportunity to talk about sustainable consumption and production and reflection of indigenous values in the 2030 Agenda. I'm representing United Nations Association of New Zealand, and I'm the Special Officer for Sustainable Economy there. My connection to United Nations started from my school as a secretary to school United Nations Association. And coincidentally, I joined with one of the United Nations Industry Development Organization's project to Sri Lanka for Sri Lankan government, Ministry of Industries and Commerce, and to help government and businesses to implement sustainable consumption production strategies and UNIDO approaches and the concepts in Sri Lanka. To start our conversation, I would thought to take your attention to the achievements of humanity in the 20th century. Now we live in 21st, but to go back to 20th century, generally in the world, that was century, human societies made amazing technological achievements. Not to mention so many like electricity, the computers, automobile, and landing in the moon, and so many. But with these achievements, the global was open for trade, liberalization, and competitiveness, and ultimately society that consumed more and produce more with this exposure to the globalization. I found this information from one of the scientific articles published in 2018 about the material consumption with our economic activities, what we are practicing today. And you can see here the same article, how the material consumption in the world will go up with the time being by 2050. And the material intensity, you can see, is going down, but how material extraction will going up. And this is the material flow of the global, and it talks about the biomass, fossil energy carriers, then other materials going through human activities and the other industrial activities, and how it going back to the environment again with that way output. When we consume human and industries and going back, how it's going back to the environment in this system. Yeah, so with this, our consumption pattern, so 20th century was the century that humans consume lots of materials taken from the natural environment, and also put back with like waste and to the environment back. And with this unresponsible consumption production, the there are lots of environmental impacts as well as socio-economic impacts created in the world. And at the same time, some of this I mention here. Most importantly, what happened was the rising of equality and equity gap in the world, the rising of poor and rich gap. Other than the total environment degradation, what I am talking about here, the climate change and degradation of soil and biodiversity depletion, and everything happened during this century. And seeing this changes happen into the world, most of the scientists came up with, they stressed, they talk about this thing in their publications, conferences, and these are some of them. And the that world attention went to Rachel Carson's Silent Sprint, that book. How many of you have read that book? Yeah, including myself. It's talk about the sprint, that we do not have birds, and no singing, no, the very silent sprint because of the unresponsible consumption of agrochemicals in the paddy fields. So that is the consumption pattern of modern and Western culture, Western economy. But at the same time, our indigenous communities, they also have facing challenges around the world, constantly encountering and struggling to maintain their traditions and their knowledge, lifestyle system, which was the dominating economic development activities because these Western economic activities are governing, and so they facing challenge how to fix into that system with their lifestyle notions. So because indigenous people, they have harmonized relationship between human, nature, and universe. So nature is living being, and they consider it as insoluble, interdependent, balanced, and complementary relationship with the universe and humanity. So I would like to just go through with these principles of cultural norms of indigenous communities. So their fundamental conditions of well-being are sufficient food, strong family and community values, caring, reciprocity and solidarity, and they respect their culture and the nature. They consider community and communitarianism. Community is the pillar which they organize their lives and social and economic activities. And then they transfer their knowledge by generation to generation and practicing with adults and learning by observation and doing changes with what they encountered in problems. So their vision development was based on harmony between nature and universe. They always think about how to consume resources effectively and sustainable consumption production. They practice that activities. They concern natural resources they didn't market them. Respect to nature and community-based management, lands and natural resources. Territories are vital to carry out social and economic cultural activities. So pivotal in discussions of sustainable consumption, production, resource conservation and management techniques based on traditional knowledge and customary systems of governance and right rituals. So one example is Kaitiaki Ganga systems in New Zealand. So that is one customary system that practiced by indigenous people. So worldwide, all these indigenous people, they have their own customary systems and social organizations to keep their, practice their economic activities. They mostly bound with universe and cosmology and spiritual practices. Traditional knowledge gave them how to adapt and mitigate with climate changes and to face into risks in their lives and also increase the surviving capabilities. However, with this modern economic development, they face into troubles and challenges to transmit their traditional knowledge to generation. Because of the schools, they are not, the knowledge is coming from the elderly people, especially their grandma and mom. So they transfer the knowledge to the young generation, so it's distracted. And some policies of modern economic plans, especially like land ownership, they lost their land ownerships, and then they lost their territories ownerships, and the cultural activities was disconnected. Then the selling products, it's trade liberalization and globalization, so the time came to sell products, not to exchange things. So with that sort of activity, their lifestyle was changed. The rising inequalities and the risk of going to debt. Then the traditional livelihood with the increase of change of life, then people, community-based lifestyle, and they was changed to individual lifestyles. What happened ultimately was they forgot the sustainable consumption production practices. So this is, I wanted to give you attention to how United Nations globally engage with this sort of issues happening in the world, starting from 1972. They were talking about in their general, the high-level assemblies and putting up conferences, conventions, and working hard to take whole world attention to sustainable development activities. So 1992, the first conference came, and on the human environment, held in Stockholm. Then the 1980 World Conservation Strategy. 83 is very important. World Commission on Environment and Development, Our Common Future. A very famous Brundtland report, Brundtland Commission. That report started in this year to publish in 1877. One slide is not here. It's all right. After 1877, then the Brundtland Commission report came, then published in 1987 with Agenda 21, and to providing the whole world governments to get action to protect environment and social and development activities. And that's, then with that initiation, lots of NGOs and governments work towards to achieve that Agenda 2021. Then after that, another Earth Summit came in 2000 or I forget, 92 Earth Summit, to talk about this Brundtland Commission report and to take actions around that. Oh gosh, it's not here. Then and that time the first important three activities happened in that Rio Summit was UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and Convention on Biological Diversity, and the non-legally binding statement of forest principles. Those are the important activities taken at that summit. In 1977, another summit, and 2002 was again another summit for sustainable consumption production. What came with Millennium Development Goals. In 2012, that was the first time that Millennium Development Goals were reviewed and then expanded it to, they wanted to put up a proper plan to get whole world into one path to achieve sustainable development. And that's the summit that talk about Sustainable Development Goals, which came on 2015. And the 2015, the world start signing Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emissions, and also published this 2030 Agenda and 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And also requested, the high-level forum requested United Nations Statistical Commission to launch progress reviewing activities in 5-year time period, how these SDGs happening in the world, and to see the progress to get into the whole world into the track. So everyone, it's a very familiar picture for most of you, the Sustainable Development Goals. And so when we can have a close look to this structure, we can see this sustainable economic development encompasses environment, economy, and social issues, but it's talk more about ecological issues, bringing environment consideration in socio-economic development plans. And therefore, I would like to tell about this framework as framework for ecologically sustainable and socially development, ecologically sustainable and socially equitable society, to bring that this is the roadmap. So today, what we talk about is sustainable consumption and production, and so this SDG 12 has targets to achieve. They have mentioned some targets and some indicators to monitor the progress. So I would like to go through a little bit about this. The first one target is to implement a 10-year framework for sustainable consumption and production, which talks about capacity building and to develop programs to implement nationally about the programs to promote and inculcate the sustainable consumption production in whole economic activities in countries. Efficient use of natural resources, and they are calculating material footprint per capita and per GDP. Then half the food waste, sound management of chemicals and hazardous waste, then reduce waste generation, adopt sustainability practices in industries, and integrate sustainability information in their reporting to see how do they progress annually and or whatever into their economic business according to their business plans. The public procurement practices based on sustainability approaches. Then they educate the nation on sustainability and sustainable lifestyles, and how to provide relevant information to education system, curricula, courses, university courses, research, etc., etc. And half the food waste through strengthen the scientific and technological capacity strengthen scientific technological innovations based on to achieve this sustainable development, and develop and implement tools to monitor the impact, not only tourism, actually whole industry processes. Then mechanisms to rationalize inefficient fossil subsidies to stop wasteful consumptions. We talk about SDG 12, sustainable consumption production, but it encompasses resource efficient production and consumption, stress, and also this concept, this message is in not only SDG 12, it's in SDG 8 and 9 and 11. They talk about how to efficient use of resource use in your whole process. And also this SDG 12, by practicing this 12, we can achieve SDG 2, zero hunger, climate action, then the life below water, life on land, and cleaner water, sanitation. They all connected to each other, and also we need partnerships to achieve this thing, achieve these processes. But this is very important because I wanted to tell them this talks about knowledge transferring. I wanted to tell here the indigenous knowledge and modern scientific knowledge, how this knowledge bring together to achieve sustainable development. So indigenous knowledge talks about their own methods of achieving economic developments. So this knowledge would fill some of the gaps of modern scientific knowledge. And also it helps indigenous community get into the economic development process. And this is a participatory approach. So they are not neglected. They are in the economic development process, sharing their knowledge and their practices. And also the challenge that they face integrate into the modern economic development. So as that challenge, they can overcome that challenge. Then the validate indigenous knowledge system, because then now when this knowledge came together and the indigenous knowledge come to the economic development process, so then again starts going by generation to generation, and empowering indigenous community again to promoting relationship and equity. So this is the end actually. So anyway, when you look closely to the SDG agenda, you can see it also talks about the indigenous values, their community values, how the harmonized life that they had. The SDG is also asking us to get into that back and reflecting values rooted indigenous society, social and economic institutions. However, I want to emphasize before I give back to Simon, still, are we enough of doing this thing? Are we enough of taking indigenous knowledge into modern economic development activities? That's my question to you all. Thank you very much.
Kia ora wātua. Just before I invite other members of the panel to do a short introduction to an idea they're bringing today, I'd like to get them to introduce themselves, if that's okay. Just say who you are and whether you're an artist or another type of practitioner. And starting with you, Sheyne. Yes, please.
Tō whalawa, kia ora. My name's Sheyne Tuffery. I'm a full-time artist. I'm Wellington born and bred, and I've got some of my works in the show here today. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nicole Miller. I'm the chair of the Friends of Taputeranga Marine Reserve. I'm an avid diver. I do a lot of work with community groups, and I'll give you a bit more detail later.
Kia ora, I'm Jesse Pirini. I'm a lecturer at Victoria University, and I'm the co-director of the Atom Te Kahawotau Innovation Space.
Tēnā wheti ki te rangi ko Ngāti Māori ki te whenua ti e Māori ora, ko Tainui te waka, ko te aroha te maunga, ko Waihau te awa, ko Ngāti Tumutumu te iwi, ko Rob Thorne toku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, I'm Rob Thorne. I'm a full-time musician and performer and composer of taonga puoro, traditional Māori musical instruments.
Kia ora, Rob, and I'm not even sure that I told you who I was. I'm Simon Bowden. So, nice to see you. Thanks very much for coming. So Sheyne, we're going to start with you. Yeah, and if you just press next screen up there, then I think eventually your first slide will show up.
Next screen.
Yeah, the right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Just right.
Kia ora koutou, talofa lawa. As I said, my name's Sheyne Tuffery. This is just a real quick introduction into some of my ideas. My work is, my work is the NASA-inspired work down the back. I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm going to talk about some other ideas and just the importance of imagination. Because I do think imagination is a really important thing that we can use to help solve a lot of the world's problems. So I'm showing you an image here. This is not mine, but this was one of the first etchings I saw when I was at art school. And it's from two Russian paper architects. And it's from the communist era of Russia. And in communist Russia, you couldn't make amazing buildings. You had to make sort of shoebox-looking things because everyone had to be the same. And these guys stood out. And they wanted to really change things. So they could only show their work overseas. And unfortunately, I got to see it in Wellington in the early 90s. They did a show at the City Gallery. And it's just these big, amazing, surrealist, just really grungy kind of work. And it really had an effect on me. And it made me sort of want to use them as like a muse and everything. And because at the time, my heritage is Samoan European. My mum's from Samoa. She came over here and met my dad. And going to art school, I had this eternal problem of sort of where you fit in and everything. I'm Samoan, but I'm New Zealander. And I sort of made that the focus of the platform from where I launched from my work. And I love the escapism of the paper architects because it was all fantasy. They couldn't build anything, so they put everything into their etchings, and it was perfect for my mind. So just going to go on to the work that sort of I started with. So this is from 1995, sort of. I'm just showing work, two bits of work that were like the end of my art school trainings, but they seem to be real poignant works that have stuck with me and are still in my studio, and I kind of refer to them and look to them for inspiration. So this was also after a lucky trip to Prague for 6 weeks, and I think I turned into a Gothic over there. I love the darkness and the sort of dystopian post-communist era. I was there in sort of the late mid-90s. So, but I also like the whole utopian thing that was coming out of it, and that was that whole thing of sort of dark to light for me. So the coconut symbols are sort of symbols of my heritage. It's a sort of like a joke, the half coconut afakasi. But also you got sort of figures of Europe sort of drawing the figure out, and that was the whole thing of when you do go overseas for the first time and you come back, you feel like you've changed a bit, or you left your soul sort of back in Europe, and almost the best thing for me coming back from overseas, I was 24, was flying over the Pacific Ocean and realising where we lived, and it's pretty much just this huge ocean and a few sort of islands in the middle of it, and I think that's home, and that sort of I think it cleared the anxiety of sort of who I was and who we are, and I thought about going about and celebrating that. So I started doing work about architecture, which sort of comes back to the guys that I was showing before, and it's just I lived in Auckland at the time, and I wanted Auckland to look like sort of we're in Auckland. We're the biggest Pacific community in the world. There's more Samoans in Auckland than there are in Samoa, and I want to sort of influence architects into showing that in an exciting way. So these are woodblock prints. That's my specialty, is chiselling and rolling ink and making prints. Unfortunately, it's not that big. I wish it was. It's about half the size. And this one's called Highrise Pacific. And this is the work I'm sort of known for. But with this show here, I chose to show some new work, which is about the moon landings from last year, the 50th anniversary. And I did a residency at the Space Place Co-Observatory. And I was trying to kind of get into that thing of being anti-fake news, and because everyone thinks the moon landing was fake. And so it was about sort of wrestling that idea and the whole thing about fake news and how we get it. So I was combining photographs of Wellington and putting Neil Armstrong at the front, and it's just starting that conversation about what happened and how science can help things and can bring the world together. Just to finish, 1968 was the first time they took a photo of the Earth by itself, and it was Apollo 8 circumnavigating the moon for the first time. And most of the astronauts' sort of takeaway from discovering the moon was, we went to the moon, but we discovered Earth. So, and it was the launch of the environmental movement, that one image. So it was, a lot of people say, what was the whole point of going to the moon? It was there to discover it and to look at it, but also they came back going, well, the Earth's just amazing. It's just sitting there in this blackness, and it works, and we've got to look after it. And that started this whole thing about caring about waterways, caring about what we're doing with the Earth. And it was a real sort of, the weirdest thing is I got into the moon landing body of work by actually just watching documentaries about conspiracy, and then I totally got flipped. So it was just a really good way of kind of your own research as an artist and finding out things. And now it's just let me down kind of a very sort of science narrative. So yes, is that enough? Yeah. Just to close, just thinking, imagination is so important. Einstein said it's more important than knowledge, so I'm sort of all for that. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, cool.
Hello, well, thanks, Shane. That was a really neat introduction, actually. So I'm a scientist by training, so I can give you a different perspective, but I'm actually not actively in the science space in the professional sense. I got into innovation and technology as well, and I think there's a bit of connection there as well. But I spend a lot of time in the water, and it's really amazing. Actually, New Zealand is a marine country. We've got so many waterways and water bodies around us that we need to look after. And we actually on land have a very big impact on our marine ecosystems. So I'm a diver. I'm the chair of the Friends of Taputeranga Marine Reserve, and it's fantastic. I don't have images as such of Taputeranga, but I've got 2 VR headsets. So I would like to invite everybody to take a virtual tour of Taputeranga after the presentation, so you can dive right into it. The reason why I've created this tour is really to showcase what we've got in the marine environment. We've got such gems right at our doorsteps, particularly here in Wellington, and not a lot of people actually get a chance to experience it themselves because it's the water, it's wet, it's cold, but for me, it is really about how to create a connection between people and our environment to actually then use that connection to show there is a lot of threats on the environment. What can we do? Speaking about the impact and that we have on our marine environment, I've been diving around Wellington for a couple of years now, and I started a little citizen science project. So I've been documenting the giant kelp and kelp forests around Wellington. And over the last couple of years, we can see a really harsh impact of increasing kinner barons, like sea urchins. Our kinner start grazing, the kinner numbers start exploding because actually the natural predators are missing, so it's overfishing is a big impact on that. And once the kinner numbers explode, they actually graze over anything in the coastal environment. marine ecosystems, particularly close to shore, the seaweed is really important as a structure for marine life to be food and also be a structure for fish and other critters to live. So it's really important. Once we get that, if we get kinderbarns, there's nothing. You can't fish, you can't eat the kinners of it. It's a real disaster zone, really, and it's a tipping point. So I've recently started to engage with local tangata whenua as well on ideas, what can we do to minimize all the different pressures on seaweed, particularly looking at kina and other stressors on the environment, and what would be ways, and building on Taputeranga Māori, what are traditional uses, how have the ecosystems been managed in previous times, and what can we learn from that? How can we build up projects that are driven by the community, by iwi, but also bring in scientists and experts to help community building, maybe look at ways of how can you not just identify cultural values, but also social values and economic opportunities out of regenerating our marine ecosystems. So we actually have an integrated approach to that, and also incentives for the communities to drive it, rather than looking at it from a Western science experiment, actually really identify the key values communities have in those ecosystems. So I'm happy to talk about it later, but I'll pass it on to...
Thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora tātou, he mihi anō tēnei ki a koutou, kia ora tātou kai whakarite, tēnā koe. Kia ora, ko Jesse Pirini tōku ingoa. My name's Jesse, and I am a lecturer at Te Herenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington, and co-director of the Atom Te Kahota, our innovation and entrepreneurship space. And I just wanted to tell you a very short story today about how through community engagement we learned a clearer perspective on Indigenous business, and in particular Māori business values, and to make some ties to this idea around sustainability. So we were supporting the Greater Wellington Regional Council to develop their Māori Regional Economic Development Strategy. So we went all around Te Upoko o Te Ika Māui, out to the Wairarapa, Kapiti Coast, here in Pōneke, and talked to the different communities there. And anyone who's done community engagement stuff will know when you go and talk to communities, you get all sorts of different perspectives. And we took in these sort of standard strategic management models to try and get people's ideas about, what would economic development look like for you? And in our very first session out at Waiwhatu Marae, at the end of the session, a 65-year-old guy stood up, and he's lived across the road from Waiwhatu Marae for years. And after our session, we'd done all these strategic models and planning sessions, and he said to us, I don't really like wearing other people's clothes, especially at my own party. And I really loved that he did it in such a kind of caring way, basically saying to us, look, we have our own ways of doing things. The things that you've brought to us are not, these sort of strategic management planning models. They don't actually fit with the way that we're thinking. And from that insight, we changed a lot of the things that we were doing. And I guess one concern I have, or one sort of potential that I think about, is the models that we use are typically quite linear in terms of building and structuring businesses. We typically aim for financial outcomes, and we talk about well-being and multiple bottom lines, but they often come afterwards. They're not deeply woven into things. And Waji talked about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practices, and supporting knowledge transfer, I think, in both directions. So so learning is going in both directions. How do you really tie these things together so that you're not saying, yeah, we want all this other stuff after the financial thing? And I think this is what this guy was trying to tell us. So we had two outcomes from this series of workshops. One is that we tried to develop strategic planning and design thinking tools that embedded this kind of thinking. And I had this idea, okay, so if you're traveling in a direction, if you're aiming to win, if you're looking for strategic and economic growth, you're moving forwards, it's very linear, but what are you leaving behind you? And this idea of sustainability is all about more non-linear thinking. So this is an example of what we have started to develop, and it's a business canvas tool. So if anyone's used a business model canvas, it's essentially a template that allows you to work on your strategic thinking with other people. So it supports, it facilitates working together and shared attention. So there are 3 things on here I want to point out, and then I'll wrap up. So in the top corner, we have this idea of puawaitanga, which refers to blooming or blossoming. So when we went into Waiwhatu Marae, we were talking about what's your mission, what's your vision, how will you win? And someone said to us, winning is very binary. You have winners and you have losers. This idea of puawaitanga is very much more, it's about blooming, it's about cycles. There's less of a linear thinking. The other thing that we have included down just under puawaitanga is these 5 bottom lines. So we have this economic outcome. We also included environmental, social, cultural, and what I thought was really interesting is political. So when people start businesses, we don't often think about this, but having political influence can be a really powerful outcome. And if you imagine powerful developers who are attending town halls, who know the councillors, who are politically active and politically involved and are able to shape decisions about how things, decisions about the environment, how can we start businesses that have political influences as a strategic outcome? And how do we weave all these things together? The last addition is this idea of tikanga running through the middle here. And what we're trying to do is tie together our analysis of the environment, which happens over here, opportunities, threats, strengths and challenges, with our values, our tikanga, our matapono. What do we think is important, and therefore what are our strategic outcomes? So still very much trying to include strategic thinking and what we have learnt, what's really good from management thinking, and tying together some more of this Indigenous perspectives on what does it mean to start a business, to run a business. There are some great examples. Wakatu Corporation down in Nelson, but a lot of our businesses are starting with very linear strategic thinking, and so how can we start to shift that conversation a little bit? There is a YouTube video, and I'll ask Simon to share the link. We just uploaded it this morning. That talks through this canvas in a little bit more detail. So if you are interested in that, we'll put it hopefully on the Facebook page. Otherwise, also we can talk further. So thank you. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, and ngā mihi rangatira. Kia ora, thank you. This is an amazing opportunity to be amongst this. I've been involved with other science and art connections, Goethe Institute. We did a kind of a locked-in residency around climate change, and that was phenomenal, and it changed my life in regards to what we have available to us and what we don't. I could talk about lots of different things as an anthropologist and as an artist, someone who works with unsustainable resources. I make instruments out of bird bones, that birds are endangered. There's whale involved. There's all kinds of things that I travel with these instruments across the world, and am constantly confronted by the possibility that I might have these taken off me for various reasons. I'm dealing with CITES, treaty and so on. I could talk about the number 3 goal that I was involved in with this in regards to health and well-being, and how my music is actually founded out of that rather than an entertainment aspect. I could talk about arts and practice and being sustainable, how artists are people that, traditionally or mythologically are people that survive on next to nothing. And the way that COVID's changed us all in regards to myself as a performer and what that means. internationally where most of my work lies. But instead, I'm going to quickly and try and really honour the fact that everyone else honoured their 5 minutes by talking about how, as an artist, my work is predominantly around performance and improvisation and innovation. And when I teach, especially school children, I often lean into the idea that improvisation is a life skill. And it's an evolutionary skill. It's a mechanism that has brought about the success of humanity. And that cooperation rather than competition is the predominant survival aspect of human evolution. It's how we surpassed Neanderthal and survived the recent Ice Age, was being able to group together and even though we're possibly the weaker out of the two, and it's how we maintain grouping and family relationships. It's in fact how we've survived rather than competition. And how this relates musically in terms of collaboration, improvisation, collaboration. It's all about survival. And I've got a little story about my youngest talking to my eldest in the back seat of the car, and I knew it was a kind of a moment of success that I had, where I knew that I was doing something right, when my daughter asked, what's improvisation? And my eldest said to her, what you're doing now, which was quite profound, really. The idea that conversation is improvisation, that we don't run off scripts, and that when we do run off scripts and we have life scripts and we stick to the same script, that eventually, as the world changes and the script doesn't, we start to fail or start to have less success. So I also just want to quickly sort of consider something that I've really had to come to terms with recently, teaching a paper up in Te Kawa Maui around the people in Polynesia. It's an unconscious, conscious bias that I've been trying to find evidence for around how ancient Māori are, but I've really had to come to terms with how young we are as a culture, possibly the youngest Indigenous culture on the planet. And that things have shifted in the last 10 years in terms of the science, and how our arrival now, we've put scientifically within a window of 25 years from 1200 AD. And so it's not 800 AD, and so these three major cultural shifts that occurred now have been jammed into 500 years rather than 900 years, and that this is a phenomenal thing. And my reasoning, my perspective has shifted to the fact that as the youngest culture on the planet, with a phenomenally rich and deep culture that developed within a very short space of time, that we're actually a culture creation focused people that are innovative. And so our strength as Indigenous is that we are innovative, and that innovation has come about through improvisation. It's one of the elements of innovation. So I think that this is our strength, is that our tradition and our tikanga and our kaupapa is innovation, and always has been. And it's about facing forward. I also just want to quickly mention that, the idea of Maui as a change maker, that he was the one that was constantly trying to shake things up, and, he's upheld as a hero and a bit of a troublemaker as well. And that this is really quite an integral part of our culture, is that Maui was a change maker, that he was trying to connect Atua world with human world, and that there's that connectedness aspect there that's going on, and that connectedness for Indigenous, for myself, it's just obvious. I was talking to Jill yesterday, this idea, of course, we're all connected, and it's something that I've never really ever considered, how I've never had to consider it. I've just grown up with that idea. And then the idea that I'm very much kind of I love words, and the idea of, I've been playing with the idea of the difference between inter and intra, And rather than interconnectedness, the intra-connectedness. So intra means from within. I think it's ironic that the word inter, when you actually look it up, talks about burying something, interring something. So the idea of intra is within. This is kind of really what I'm kind of really coming to terms with. As Indigenous, we're from within. We're not connected to nature. We're of and within, and we are nature. I think that's really... Oh, I just wanted to respond to Sheyne. I really love the idea of Earth, and coming to terms with Earth from from out in space. Oops, sorry, now I'm going over time. But a good friend of mine, Tui Allen, wrote a book called Ripple, which was it's a whole lot of sentient dolphins who have been around for millions of years and have huge brains, and some of them are astronomers. But the dolphins, they call Earth azure, because that's what it predominantly is. It's actually blue. It's not brown. It's not earth. It's more water than it is earth. So, kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Let's keep talking until the students that are coming for a tour at 1 o'clock, which is in 4 minutes, arrive. I think, Waji, you set a path for us here to talk about the history of the development of the Sustainable Development Goals and the terrible state that we've gotten through the way we've grown and the way we've consumed, and that a pathway forward involves Indigenous thinking. And I just wonder if everyone might want to give an example, perhaps, like Nicole, you might give an example about how you are working with mana whenua, or someone you might like to talk, others might like to talk about from a practice perspective, about how Indigenous thinking is helping with the creation of work or in community. Because I think the pathway is there. There is hope that through engagement with Indigenous ideas and Indigenous peoples, then there is some pathways to sustainability. So perhaps if we could give some examples, just so that we can all go away with a starting point, a sense of a notion of a starting point about how we might be able to do that. And of course, this is nothing to take. This is something that has to happen together and has to be led. The Indigenous voices must lead, so it's not up to us to take, it's up to us to listen and be. Who feels like they could go first?
I'm still thinking.
Sheyne's still thinking? Nicole.
Yeah, I can probably reflect on a project I was privileged to be part of, and it was establishing a Maitaitai reserve in Mahia Peninsula. And that was fantastic because I got an invite to just share what citizen science project I was running in Wellington. And I was really conscious about engaging in a way that I say, this is what we do in Wellington, here's a few things, and there's a toolbox of opportunities just to go and monitor the environment. But I'm really not here to say, this is how you should be doing it. I'm actually just really part of the journey and just trying to help share my perspective. And it's been really good. It was a long process. We had a couple of wanangas up in Mahia, and it was incredibly powerful to be part of the first ones where the local hapu were sharing their stories and their connection to the local environment, the values, why it is important. And really that was key to bring out why should the community actually be concerned in running a project, looking after the environment. And it's been such a cool outcome to, one, get the Maitaitai in place and have the community chosen some monitoring methods that they want to use to show the impact of the Maitaitai, but also seeing the flow-on effect about how the Kaumātua now engaging with the mokupunas and bring in the environmental school so the kids learn about it. The kids learn about the stories. Often the stories are so precious to the different hapu that they don't necessarily share it even across like a small area. So it actually has been so powerful to bring all the people together, and it's still working. And I look forward to do more stuff around Wellington as well, because that has been in an environment where we had people in a more rural area. It's quite different. Wellington, we've got different pressures, so we'll see what's working there.
Kia ora, Nicole. Anybody else want to brave the clatter of the children arriving? Make a comment? Yes.
So just quickly, we in the Wairarapa there's a florist, and she calls her florist puti puti, and which means flower. And so I didn't know this, but a lot of flowers that florists sell are imported, and when they come in, they fumigate them, and then we buy them and put them in our houses and smell them. And so she when she plans people's florist arrangements for weddings and stuff, she'll ask them what they really like about their environment, and she'll base her florist arrangement around local flowers that come from the area where the person comes from, and then they return to that area. So the flowers grow, she picks them, and then they go back and kind of grow again. And it's this kind of circular idea. And 95% of businesses in New Zealand have 5 or fewer employees. So it's these small businesses changing their practices that I think will have a real impact.
Yeah. Got something yet, Sheyne?
I still think.
Yeah, I can add. I just want to say that as an artist and as a Māori and as an academic, I'm constantly engaged in conversations that end up as labour, that end up as cultural labour for people who are non-Māori but are desperately trying to connect, or maybe they might just need their homework done by someone else. And I'd just really like to say that as an anthropologist, the success of modern anthropology has come about through an understanding that research and work needs to be grounded. And this is the case for collaboration. So the definition of grounded that I'm using is the one where, when you enter a community, you leave all your agendas at the gate and you ask them what they need. And that, for me, is currently kind of like my catch cry when it comes to decolonisation. That those that are unable to decolonise because they're not colonised, or they are the coloniser, therefore they can't colonise, so they can't decolonise, so they must provide space and uphold and uplift and support and be ally to those, which means they need to know what those people need. It was a classic one in, I think, my 3rd year anthro, just before I did my master's, where it was this idea of, the anthropologist goes into the jungle and says, I want to study, matrilinealism. And there's a well that needs digging, and so the best thing that anthropologist can do is ask where the spade is and ask how to dig the hole and where you want the well, and then get behind and start digging, and from there maybe their research might be able to continue. But until the necessary is done, then nothing can be done.
Is that like the idea of starting in the wharikai, peeling the potatoes?
Yeah.
A bit like that? Yeah. Sheyne?
Yeah, I've got nothing as good as these stories, but...
Come on. But your practice, you talked about growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but having this identity. So
yeah,
for you...
it was a double-edged sword. So it was a great platform to... I think every artist needs a little kind of kickstart, and that was sort of my one. It's kind of that whole isolation thing. I was writing for David Bowie, and the whole thing of being... Because my work's always had a bit of a sci-fi thing about extraterrestrial kind of other kind of thing. But in regards to what we're talking about, it's that I'm doing these workshops now where kind of thinking more about the materials that I'm using. Of course, because I'm a printmaking tutor, it's just asking people to bring stuff out of their garage now and not use pencils anymore, and try and make compositions with leaves and ferns and stuff, and even plastic meat trays. Of course, wash them before you bring them along. And, it's just that whole thing of you don't need much to construct things. Of course, I sort of direct them, but it's a kind of a start for sort of my journey and sort of the guys that do workshops with me. It is quite cool. You're sort of starting that sort of journey of trying to use things a bit more rather than discarding. And before you throw them out to the recycle bin, you go, can I print that? Cut it out, kind of thing. And so that less is more. Things that, it's just great to hear these stories, kind of thing, and
It absolutely is and was. And so thank you very much. Let's give them a big round of applause.